Nu skal jeg sige velkommen til Robert Whitaker, som jo, må vi sige, forhåbentlig kommer ind og sætter et præg på en meget aktuel diskussion, også i vores del af verden i forhold til psykiatrien. Og jeg ved, at Roberts bog har vakt meget debat rundt omkring, og jeg ved også, at gode kræfter i Psykovision er ved at oversætte den bog, og den formentlig er klar til at være på gaden i foråret, siger Jørgen, eller nikker Jørgen. Så hvis man ikke har mod på at gå i gang med et engelsksproget bog, så kommer den foråret. Ja, det var bare lidt reklame for det. Jeg glæder mig rigtig meget til at høre oplæg. Jeg har set de 84 slides, og jeg ved ikke, hvordan det kan lade sig gøre på en time. Jeg har prøvet at dividere gange og så videre, men Robert siger, at det går alt sammen. So I'm just talking about, you have 84 slides. Okay, you will short them down. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. But from all of us to you, very welcome here in Vejle in Jutland. I know you yesterday had a presentation in Copenhagen.
That's right.
And some bad Danish guys broke into Robert's hotel room, pick up his phone and his computer. Yeah, not a very polite society. But we will welcome you. We will not take anything away from you. Thank you very much for coming.
You. Thanks. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. It's my first time in Denmark. Is this too loud? Okay. Anyway, I just want to say thank you for having me here. It's great to be here. As far as the robbery, we expect this to happen in the United States, not in Denmark. So, and I also want to thank Olga from the Danish Hearing Voices Network. She's the one who really made this possible. So thank you. It is a great pleasure to be here. A little bit of how I came to be writing about psychiatry. So I'm a journalist by background. I'm not a doctor. I've been writing and I was a newspaper reporter for a long time. My beat was medicine. I focused on covering medicine and science. For a while, I was director of publications at Harvard Medical School. So I was trained very much in traditional sort of approaches to medicine. And the way I got writing about psychiatry was in a very backdoor manner. In 1998, I was doing a series for the Boston Globe on abuses of patients in psychiatric research settings. And at that time, I had a completely conventional understanding about the progress of modern psychiatry. I believed we were making great progress in treating mental disorders. I believed the drugs we had fixed chemical imbalances, like they were insulin for diabetes, that metaphor, I believed it was true. And as one of the things that we wrote about in this series was a series of studies that had been done in the United States where they withdrew schizophrenia patients from their medications. And we said that was a very unethical thing to do because the drugs are like insulin for diabetes. You would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic, so why would you withdraw an antipsychotic from a person diagnosed with schizophrenia? However, while I was doing that research, I came upon some studies by the World Health Organization that challenged that belief, that raised a question for me. These were studies done in the 1970s and 1980s, and they compared outcomes in 3 poor countries, or 3 developing countries, India, Nigeria, and Colombia, schizophrenia outcomes, over a 5-year period and a 2-year period, with outcomes in the US and 6 other developed countries. One of the countries I'm pretty sure in this study was, in fact, Denmark. And each time, they found that outcomes for the schizophrenia patients were much better in the poor countries of the world, specifically in India and Nigeria. And the diagnosis, by the way, was being made by Western doctors. And the WHO investigators concluded that living in a developed country is, quote, a strong predictor you won't have a good outcome. And I wondered why, with all our great Western medicine, and with all our understanding that we were understanding the biology of these mental disorders, and we had the drugs that fix chemical imbalances, why would be living in a developed country a strong predictor you'll do poorly? And I was curious. And then I looked at the studies, and again, My understanding at this time was that antipsychotics are absolutely essential for schizophrenia. And after the first such study, which was 5 years in length, the WHO investigators hypothesized that the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries was that the patients were more medication compliant. So they took their medications more regularly. So in the second study, they looked at medication usage, and what did they find? They found that in the poor countries, they did use the medications acutely for the psychotic episode, but they did not maintain most of their patients on the drugs long term. So they only, in fact, kept 16% of their patients on the drugs long term, where, of course, that is the standard of care in the US and other Western societies. So you can see I had a conundrum, a curiosity. I believe that the medications were absolutely essential, but yet in this cross-cultural study, there were better outcomes in countries that were using the medications very differently. So I wrote a first book called Mad in America to really explore this failure to get good outcomes in Western countries. I wrote that book in 2002. It was titled Mad in America. As you know, this can be a very controversial subject. My agent said, please do not write any more books about psychiatry. You'll ruin your career. Do something else. So I wrote a couple other books, but then people began asking, well, what about anxiety? What about depression? What about bipolar illness? How are we doing treating those other disorders? So I came back to write a book called Anatomy of an Epidemic that really asked this question, two questions. One, is this drug-based paradigm of care working for us as a society? Does it reduce the burden of mental illness in our society? That's one big question. And then the second big question is, how do the medications shape lives over the long term in terms of employment, socialization, that sort of thing? And what I'm going to do today is two things. We're going to look at the data of the disability data in Western societies that have adopted this paradigm of care. And then as a case study, we'll just look at what science is telling us about how medications, antipsychotic medications, shape the long-term outcome of schizophrenia. Obviously, in this time, we can't do it for all these different disorders, but I thought I would focus on antipsychotics and schizophrenia for this reason. If there's any class of drugs that we should be certain provide a long-term benefit, it's the antipsychotics for schizophrenia, because we tell patients you have to be on these drugs for a long life, and at least in the United States, there's a lot of social pressure for people to stay on the medications, so we should see quite clearly in the science that the medications improve long-term outcomes. So I'm going to skip just a bit. So one of the things I did in this as a first step in this book was just look at the number of people on disability in the United States. In other words, they get a social services payment because they've been, quote, disabled by mental illness, unable to work. Now, the reason I picked 1987 as a starting point here, this is the year that Prozac comes to market in the United States, and Prozac is the first of the second-generation psychiatric drugs, which are said to be better than the first. So we get SSRI antidepressants. They're said to be better than the old tricyclics. And then we get the atypical antipsychotics. These are drugs like Zyprexa, Risperdal. You all know these drugs. And they're said to be better than the old antipsychotics that came to market in the 50s and 60s. So this is the modern era when we really use these drugs and that we really have a drug-based paradigm of care. For example, in the United States, we, in 1987, spent about $800 million on psychiatric drugs. In 2007, we spent about $40 billion. So that's a 50-fold increase. Now, generally, when you have effective medical treatments for a disorder, you're going to hope that the burden of that disorder either stays the same in society or hopefully even goes down. Does that make sense? You have an effective treatment. Instead, what has happened in the United States is the burden of disability has risen dramatically. We had 1.25 million adults on disability in the United States in 1987, and now we have, well, it was 4 million in 2007. We are now approaching 5 million people on disability. Even since I did the research, we've got about another 1 million people going on disability. So it raises an obvious question. As we embrace this paradigm of care, and as we embrace the increased use of drugs, why the rising disability? Now, since I wrote this book, I've been asked to speak in many foreign countries, and generally when I go, I try to find out the disability numbers for those countries. This is the disability for New Zealand. And you'll see in this 20-year period about a quadrupling of the people on disability due to mental illness. Australia, same thing. During this time of 20 years of this modern era, about a quadrupling of disability. This is a little bit different slide. This, by the way, should be 1993 to 1995. This is looking at new cases of disability in Iceland. And what's interesting here is if you chart the use of SSRI antidepressants, they begin to take off here. And you see suddenly this rise in disability in Iceland. This is like a threefold increase in new cases per year. Thanks to Olga, she gave me the data for Denmark. You're seeing the same thing in Denmark. This is last 11 year new cases of disability. You'll see it went from around 3,000 to 9,000. By the way, this disability rate by a per capita rate is much greater than even in the United States. In fact, I think it's one of the highest rates you'll find anywhere. And here's the other thing, is if you look at all your new cases, it's gone from about 25% to around 50%. In other words, all your new cases of disability, in 1999, mental cases due to mental illness was 25%. You're now up to 50%. So what does this data show us? I think it shows us that, at the very least, it raises a question about the merits of this paradigm of care that we've embraced. And the question is this: why, as we diagnose more people and as we use more medications, do you get an increase in disability? Because this is really remarkable. And it's happening in society after society. Now, this disability data, I don't think proves anything one way or another about the merits of the medication. It just raises a question. And then what we want to do is we want to go to the science and see what the history of science tells us about how these medications shape long-term outcomes. So we're going to do the case study on schizophrenia outcomes. Now, the first thing as a journalist I have to do is figure out, well, what is the evidence base for the use of these medications? Because obviously there is an evidence base, and it really consists of three parts. And the first part is, if you take people going into an emergency room, and these studies go back to the 1960s, and you randomize one half of the group to drug, antipsychotic, the other drug to placebo, and you look 6 weeks later, you'll see in the drug-treated group, generally, a greater abatement of the psychotic symptoms. And so that's why the drugs are seen as effective over the short term. And in the United States, basically, as long as a drug is effective over a 6-week period on the target symptom of the disorder, it gets approved. Okay? That's why it comes to market. Now, in the 1960s, when psychiatrists were putting patients on these drugs, they had another question. How long should they be on the drugs? And they ran studies designed like this. They took that subset of patients diagnosed with schizophrenia that responded well to the drug. In other words, their psychotic symptoms abated. And in that subset of good responders, they withdrew half abruptly in a randomized design. The other half they maintained on the drug. And with great regularity, those withdrawn from the drug relapsed at a higher rate. They were re-hospitalized at a higher rate. So researchers said, see, they take away the drug and the disease returns. That's what they perceived. Okay? And that, if you look today, say in the New England Journal of Medicine, this is the rationale for long-term use. The drugs reduce the risk of relapse. Now, I think there is a third part of the evidence base, and it's actually rooted in what the doctor sees. So what does the doctor see? Person comes to the emergency room, they go on the drug, and they see their symptoms abate. The drug works, right? Maybe that person goes home, and then they abruptly stop taking the drug. They relapse, they come back to the hospital. So what does the doctor see? You stop taking the drug, you get sick again. So this really is the evidence base for the long-term use of the drugs. The next question is there anything missing from the evidence base? Imagine, and there's really, well, you'll see there's three things missing from it. Imagine we ran a study like this. We take people coming into the emergency room, first episode psychosis. We put half on psychosocial care, but we don't put them on drug. The other half we put on drug. And now we follow them not for 6 weeks, but for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And over here we have a group never exposed to drug. This we might call the natural course of schizophrenia. Do the drug studies tell us about this? They don't. What the relapse studies tell us is once you're on drug, it's really bad to come off abruptly. But these studies do not tell us what might be the natural course of schizophrenia, the sort of spectrum of outcomes. The second problem is it's clear now that there is a problem with the design of the relapse studies. It's well known now that if you abruptly withdraw a psychiatric drug, you increase the risk of relapse. And in 1996, for example, a researcher at the University of California named Patricia Gilbert, she wrote an article in which she summarized all the relapse studies for antipsychotics, and she said, look, you get a much higher relapse rate when you withdraw the drug. But at that point, a very famous psychopharmacologist named Russ Baldessarini from Harvard said, but wait a minute. Most of these studies are abrupt withdrawal. How about the relapse rate when we gradually taper the drugs? Now, he found very few such studies, but he found a few, and he found that when the drugs were gradually withdrawn, the relapse rate was only 1/3 as high as when the drugs were abruptly withdrawn. And he actually found at that time, this is in the 80s and 90s, that about 38% of the patients gradually withdrawn from the drugs did in fact relapse, but the other 62% in the first 6 months. But the 62% that didn't relapse in the first 6 months had an excellent chance, quote, of remaining well indefinitely. So when you looked at gradual withdrawal, you began to get a different picture of perhaps the need to be on these medications for life. Now, the final thing is, today doctors have no clinical experience with unmedicated schizophrenia. Okay, what they see is people put on drugs right away, and they see what happens to people long-term on drugs, but they no longer see the natural course of the disorder. They're limited in their perceptions, right? Okay, what's my next step as a journalist? So you can see that there's some obvious flaws in the evidence base for long-term use. Then I went to the researcher literature and said, okay, can people point to me other studies other than the relapse literature that shows that these drugs improve the long-term course of schizophrenia? And a man named Emmanuel Stipp, who is at the University of Montreal, did this exercise in 2002. He scanned the literature, and he concluded this. And neuroleptics is another word for antipsychotics. So he says, after 50 years of using these drugs, are we able to answer the following simple question? Are these drugs effective in treating schizophrenia? And he says, there is no compelling evidence on the matter when long-term is considered. This is 50 years after we began using these drugs. And then he says this. He says, if we wish to base psychiatry on evidence-based medicine, we run a genuine risk in taking a close look at what has long been considered fact. And what you all are doing here today by inviting me is taking this risk. And I'm serious about this. But for me as a journalist, this was important to me because it said this was a valid scientific inquiry. It was like a green light. I wasn't coming out of this for some ideological reason to see if the drugs are bad, but this was a valid inquiry to do. Okay, now, he just said there's no evidence on the matter. So now I'm going to go back through the literature and see if, in fact, there is such evidence. The first thing I wanted to do was to understand the Hippocratic Oath. Now, we understand the Hippocratic Oath to say, do no harm. Don't make your patient worse. But actually, Hippocrates was getting at something much more subtle than that. And let's imagine this. Let's say you have a treatment for a disease in which 50% of your patients are cured and the other 50% stay the same. No one gets worse. Does that treatment meet the Hippocratic Oath? Hippocrates says you don't know unless you know about the natural capacity to recover. So you have to compare your medical treatment to this natural capacity to recover. And what Hippocrates is saying is human beings often have an extraordinary resilience to recover from disease. And so let's say the natural course of that disease is 70% naturally recover or cured, and only 30% stay the same. And with your treatment, now only 50% are cured. You've actually lowered the recovery rate, right? So your therapy actually has done harm, even though no one has done worse. And that's what he's reminding us of. If we want to assess the merits of our interventions, we have to try to flesh out what is the natural course of the disorder. So, the next thing I wanted to do is, well, what sort of outcomes were we getting in the Western world in the decade prior to the arrival of chlorpromazine? Chlorpromazine is remembered today as the first antipsychotic medication. It's introduced into asylum medicine in 1955. I think it's marketed in Europe as Largactil, if you remember that term. So in 1956, shortly after the introduction of these drugs, the National Institute of Mental Health, which is our lead agency, federal agency for funding research into mental disorders, held a conference to raise this very question. How are we going to know if these new drugs work, they asked, and they pointed to these studies of first episode schizophrenia as an example of the outcomes they were getting prior to the use of the drugs. Now, when you look at this data right away, there's a surprise. Because what we remember today is that we say to ourselves is prior to the arrival of the antipsychotics, people with schizophrenia couldn't live outside the hospital. And it was the arrival of these drugs that made it possible for people with this disorder to live outside. And you find that's not true. From 1945 to 1955, in the decade before the arrival of these drugs, and this is of first episode patients, you'll see that around 2/3 would be discharged within 12 to 18 months. And more important, when they went back at 3 years or 5 years later, roughly 70% would be living independently in the community. Employment rates at this time were well above 50% of the first episode cohort. And when they followed women at this time, women patients, they noticed a high percentage were getting married, and there's this line, many function okay in the domestic role. This is a different time, of course, but what they were saying is many are coming back and becoming homemakers and all. There was a similar study done in England. Now, England at this time was diagnosing schizophrenia much more narrowly, and they found the same outcomes. After 5 years, 33% were just no longer had the symptoms. It was like they had a time of schizophrenia, and another 20% were working as well. So what you really see in this data is this. About 5 years after initial diagnosis, about 1/3 would just not be, they just wouldn't be hearing the voices, they wouldn't be having the symptoms we say are characteristic of the disorder. There would be another 1/3 that would still be, quote, symptomatic, but they would be able to function okay in the outside world. And then there'd be about 1/3 that became chronically ill. And it's that 1/3 that became chronically ill that piled up in the hospital, right? Because they didn't get out. So people working in the hospital became very familiar with the chronic course of schizophrenia. And they sort of forgot about these people coming in and out. So this is our baseline. And we're going to hope that the medications improve on this baseline outcome. All right, the very first, now I'm going to do what I'm going to do. We're going to try to do this in about the next 20 minutes, is look at all the evidence that can be found since that time that looks at how these medications shape long-term outcomes. The first such study was done by the NIMH in the 1960s. It had 4 arms. 3 of the arms were treated with an antipsychotic upon entry to the hospital. The 4th was treated in placebo. And the reason you have 3 arms, they were testing 3 different drugs. At the end of 6 weeks, the drug-treated patients were doing better. However, many of the placebo patients were doing better. Then the patients were discharged, and they're followed for a year. And the researchers noticed something odd. At the end of 1 year, it was the drug-treated patients that were most likely to be rehospitalized. So at this very early moment of the long-term outcomes literature, we see the vaguest hint of a paradox. Drugs that are effective over the short term, possibly increasing the chronicity over the long term. Next thing is I looked at the perception of clinicians at the time the drugs were introduced. Did they notice a change in the course of the illness, of the disorder? And here's what you see researchers saying. My patients are getting better faster. But boy, are they coming back to the hospital in droves. And to describe this new course, they invented this phrase, the revolving door syndrome. And it comes from after the drugs are introduced. And they're describing how people go out, but they come back in. By the way, this paper was written by Jonathan Cole. He was one of the co-authors. He was the head of the Psychopharmacology Service Center at the NIMH. He's our top psychopharmacological doctor at the time. Second, he notices that relapse during drug administration is greater in severity than when no drugs are given. They're becoming more severely ill. And then he notices after you're exposed to the drug, if you come off, you tend to have symptoms that persist and intensify. He writes in 1978 a paper titled this: Maintenance Antipsychotic Therapy. Is the cure worse than the disease? And you can see he's worried here. Then the NIMH funded a retrospective study. This was done by Samuel Bachhoven at Boston Psychopathic Hospital. And he had 5-year outcomes for a cohort of psychotic patients treated with psychosocial care in 1947. And he had a similar cohort treated in 1967 with psychosocial care plus the medications. And he reported this: the relapse rate was higher in the modern era, and more important was the functional outcomes. In the 1947 cohort, 76% were functioning independently in the community 5 years after diagnosis, whereas in the 67 cohort, they were much more socially dependent. So what does Samuel Bachhoven conclude? And watch how he is surprised by his own findings. He says, unexpectedly, these data suggest that the drugs may not be indispensable. Their extended use may prolong the social dependency of many discharged patients. That's a retrospective view. Now next, because of this, the NIMH funded 3 studies in the 1970s to reinvestigate the use of these drugs. And these studies, and there's very few studies like this in the literature, basically they all have something of this design. You take patients, you either treat half with conventional care, or the other half are going to be treated without drugs or some selective use of drugs, okay? This one study was done by Maurice Rappaport at the University of California, San Francisco. It's 81, I think that is, yeah, or 80 young schizophrenia patients. It's first episode. They haven't been in the hospital before. The design is you're either treated with drug in the hospital, and you're not treated with placebo. It's just no drug. Then you're discharged, and you're followed for 3 years. No meds off means you were not on meds in the hospital, and in the 3 years, the patient stayed off the drugs. In that follow-up, it's a naturalistic design. People are free to go on or off drugs, but no meds off means they were never exposed. Antipsychotic means antipsychotic in the hospital, and they stayed on for the 3 years. Of the group that was treated without meds in the hospital, 24 of the 41 never needed to go on drugs. In other words, they got through their psychotic break, and in the 3 years, they never went on. And it was that 24 that were able to go through their break without going on the drug that had by far the best outcomes. You'll see this scale of 1 to 7. This is a really good outcome. You'll see the rehospitalization rate, 8%. A rehospitalization rate for those who are medication compliant, 73%. So it was much higher for the drug group. The lowest was for the never exposed group. What did Maurice Rappaport conclude? Again, he's surprised here, right? It's not the treatment of choice. If you're interested in, here's the key word, long-term clinical improvement, as opposed to short-term symptom suppression. He's changing the perspective here. And you can see as we maybe need to rethink this because the outcomes were better for those on the whole not treated with drug in the hospital. And by the way, no one is saying here that the drugs have no place, that there aren't a use short-term, or that maybe some people benefit long-term. They're just looking at how the medications shape aggregate outcomes.